You were never supposed to learn how to want like this. Not from a book, not in private, not without permission. But in 1749, someone wrote a story that taught readers how to desire without shame, without fear, without supervision. Governments didn't ban it because it was obscene. They banned it because it worked. And once desire learns how to function on its own, no law can fully control what comes next. People like to believe censorship protects morality. It doesn't. It protects predictability. Because a person who understands their own reactions becomes harder to guide, harder to frighten, harder to manage. That is what this story is about. Not scandal, not arousal, recognition. The moment someone notices their own sensations and realizes they do not need permission to feel them, after that, authority changes shape. It must. And that is why a small novel printed quietly in the 18th century caused a reaction far larger than itself. Not because it showed anything new, because it made something familiar impossible to ignore. Before the trials, before the bans, before anyone decided this book was dangerous, it entered the world quietly, printed without warning, sold without spectacle, passed from hand to hand like something ordinary. And that was the first mistake. Because real danger never announces itself. It waits. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It was a woman telling her story, her body, her experiences, her sensations. But the problem was not what she described. It was how. Calm, precise, unashamed, as if pleasure were not a confession, but a fact, as if desire did not need forgiveness to exist. And in the 18th century, that tone alone was enough to unsettle an entire system. Women were not supposed to speak like this, not about their bodies, not about wanting, not about enjoyment remembered without regret. A woman's body was meant to be managed, interpreted, disciplined. And here was a voice that refused instruction, that refused permission. Readers felt it immediately. Not shock, recognition. Something inside them leaned forward. They did not just read the scenes. They stayed with them, returned to them, let them replay. This was the shift. The dangerous one. From watching desire to inhabiting it. From observing sin to rehearsing pleasure privately. And once desire can be learned in private, control begins to fail. Quietly, invisibly. The authorities understood this without theory. They saw readers linger. They saw copies move faster than expected. They saw attention, curiosity, repetition. This was not corruption, it was education. And education without supervision has always frightened power more than ignorance ever could. So the language changed. Pleasure became obscenity. Imagination became contamination. Reading became evidence. And for the first time, sex was no longer treated only as a moral risk. It was treated as a mental one, something that could reshape a person without leaving marks, something that could spread silently, thought to thought. Long after the page was closed, this was the real crime. Not sex, autonomy. The trial did not begin because people were behaving differently. It began because people were thinking differently. Courts spoke the language of obscenity, but obscenity was only a mask. Underneath was fear. Fear of influence. Fear of a book that bypassed every approved authority. No priest, no husband, no doctor, no law. Just a text and a reader alone with their imagination. Worse than that, the book did not confuse the reader. It made them feel competent.
It suggested that desire could be understood from the inside, that the body did not require external explanation. This could not be allowed. So the state escalated. Copies were seized, printers questioned, the author arrested. The message was precise. This book is forbidden. Touch it, and you will pay. But prohibition always miscalculates curiosity. The moment the book was banned, it transformed. It stopped being literature. It became contraband. And contraband carries a promise approved objects never can. It suggests truth, access, something powerful enough to require force. Reading became a quiet rebellion, not loud, not visible, just dangerous enough to feel alive. People read not because they agreed, but because they wondered why it was feared. And in secrecy, the state's worst prediction came true. The book stopped being a single object. It became a pattern, a shared mental reference, a silent network of imaginations shaped by the same permission to feel. This is where censorship failed completely. By trying to erase the book, they proved its power. They taught readers that desire, when articulated clearly, was strong enough to summon courts, strong enough to justify prison, strong enough to be treated like a weapon. And once a reader understands that wanting can provoke institutional violence, something shifts. The body stops feeling trivial. Pleasure stops feeling weak. It begins to feel like leverage. This was no longer a story about sex. It was a lesson about control.
About how fragile authority becomes when people learn to govern their own sensations. And once that lesson is learned, it does not matter how many pages are burned. The real text has already moved into the mind, into the body, into a place no law can reach. Once the ban was announced, something strange happened. The book did not disappear. It multiplied. Not physically, mentally. People who had never read it now knew its name. People who had never cared about erotic literature now wondered what could frighten courts this deeply. Moral panic did the work censorship could not. Sermons warned against it, pamphlets condemned it, newspapers hinted at its dangers without naming its contents, and every warning acted like an invitation. The message was clear even when the words were not. There is something in this book you are not trusted to handle, and trust is the first thing people question when it is taken from them. Readers did not approach the book with innocence anymore. They approached it with intention, with anticipation, with the sense that opening its pages meant crossing a line. That feeling alone changed the experience. The act of reading became charged, private, intimate, not just with the text, but with oneself. This is how panic spreads, not through behavior, but through attention. The authorities spoke louder. They described corruption, decay, social collapse. They framed desire as infection, as something that could spread from one mind to another without physical contact. And in doing so, they accidentally described exactly why the book was effective. It operated below visibility, below enforcement, inside imagination, where law has no language. The more they tried to define the danger, the more clearly readers sensed it. This book does not force you to act. It teaches you how to imagine acting. And imagination is far harder to police than behavior. This was the moment when fear fully replaced morality. The fear that if people could privately rehearse desire, they might privately rehearse disobedience too. This was never about sex destroying society. It was about people learning to want without being watched.
and that terrified those who depended on supervision to rule.
What happened next became a pattern that would repeat for centuries. The book was no longer treated as an isolated offense. It became a precedent, a warning, proof that ideas could be dangerous without being political, that pleasure itself could destabilize obedience. Future bans would borrow the same logic: protect the public, preserve morality, prevent contamination. But the real objective remained constant: maintain control over how people relate to their own bodies. This is where modern censorship was born. Not in violence, not in revolution, but in fear of private experience. The lesson learned by the state was simple. You cannot stop people from wanting, but you can try to control how they learn to want. Schools would teach restraint. Churches would teach shame. Medicine would pathologize desire. Law would threaten punishment. All to undo what a single book had quietly demonstrated: that pleasure does not require permission to function, that the body can educate itself through imagination alone, and that once someone experiences desire as self-directed rather than supervised, authority becomes less absolute, less sacred, less convincing. This is why the book never truly disappeared. It did not need to. Its function had already been absorbed into culture. Every later banned novel, every censored film, every restricted image followed the same path. Declare it dangerous. Frame it as protection. Watch curiosity intensify. Watch private consumption increase. Watch control weaken in places that cannot be monitored. This is the irony censorship never escapes. By naming something forbidden, it teaches people where to look. By punishing desire, it teaches people that desire matters. And once that understanding settles in, it changes the relationship between the individual and authority permanently. This is the legacy of that first ban. Not scandal, not arousal, awareness. The realization that power is deeply uncomfortable with anything that trains people to feel on their own terms. And that discomfort has never gone away. It has only learned how to disguise itself better. The most important effects of the book never appeared in public records. No court transcript could capture them. No sermon could fully describe them. They happened quietly, inside the reader, in the space between thought and sensation. People did not finish the book and immediately change their lives. That would have been visible, dangerous. Instead, something slower happened. The reader began to notice their own reactions. Their attention lingered longer than expected. Their imagination returned to certain images without being invited. Desire stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like a signal. This was new. Not the feeling itself, but the awareness of it. The book did not tell readers what to do. It showed them how it felt to want without collapsing into shame. That distinction mattered. Shame interrupts sensation. It breaks continuity. It keeps desire fragmented and manageable. The book removed that interruption. It allowed pleasure to be remembered as coherent, as something that could be observed, analyzed, even understood. And once desire becomes understandable, it becomes harder to dismiss as weakness. Readers began to experience their bodies differently, not as enemies, not as temptations to be resisted, but as sources of information. This is where authority loses ground, because systems of control rely on internal conflict, on people policing themselves through guilt and fear. When that internal conflict softens, obedience becomes less automatic, not gone, just delayed, questioned. The book did not create rebels.
it created hesitation, a pause between instruction and compliance. And in that pause, people felt something unfamiliar: ownership. Not political ownership, psychological ownership. The sense that what happens inside the body might belong to the person experiencing it. This was never loud, never announced, but it spread anyway, one reader at a time, one private realization at a time. And no law was equipped to deal with that.
The ban did not end the anxiety. It institutionalized it. Long after the book faded from headlines, the fear it triggered remained embedded in how societies talked about sex. Not openly, structurally. Desire became something to be regulated early, framed carefully, introduced with warnings. Children were taught ignorance before knowledge. Adults were taught restraint before understanding. Pleasure was allowed only after justification. Marriage, reproduction, medicine, anything that could surround desire with supervision. This was the long-term response, not suppression, but management. The lesson learned was simple. If desire can be self-taught, authority weakens. So desire must always be mediated, interpreted, explained by approved voices. This logic shaped censorship far beyond books. It shaped education systems, diagnostic manuals, entertainment ratings. The idea that some experiences are safe only when filtered by institutions became normal, invisible, rarely questioned. And yet, the original fear never left. It adapted. Every time a new medium appeared, the same anxiety resurfaced. Novels, photographs, film, the internet. Each time the argument repeated itself with different language. This will corrupt, this will destabilize, this will teach people things too quickly. And beneath every version of that argument was the same concern first exposed centuries earlier. What happens if people learn how to feel without us? What happens if the body becomes a source of knowledge rather than a problem to solve? That fear did not belong to the 18th century. It belongs to any system that depends on delayed awareness, on people not fully understanding their own responses. And that is why the book still matters. Not because anyone reads it cover to cover anymore, but because it revealed something power has never been comfortable admitting. Control does not fail when people act. It fails earlier, when people begin to feel clearly. When they stop being confused by their own sensations, when desire becomes legible from the inside. That is the moment authority starts to lose its grip, quietly, permanently. Centuries passed, but the problem never changed. Only the interface did. When desire could no longer be controlled through books, it moved to images. When images escaped regulation, it moved to sound, then to film, then to screens small enough to fit inside a pocket. Each time, the same anxiety returned wearing a new uniform. This medium is too immediate. This experience is too personal. This teaches people too much, too fast. The logic was identical, because the threat was identical. A person alone with a stimulus, learning how their body responds without supervision. The modern world did not invent this fear. It inherited it. Algorithms replaced priests. Guidelines replaced sermons. Community standards replaced moral law. The language softened, but the objective stayed precise. Shape desire before it shapes the individual. Filter experience. Delay awareness. Keep sensation interpretable by authority. And just like before, the moment something is restricted, attention intensifies. People lean closer, watch longer, listen more carefully. The forbidden does not repel, it focuses. This is why censorship online rarely removes content. It reroutes it, hides it, pushes it underground where it becomes more concentrated, more intentional, more psychologically potent. People no longer stumble into desire accidentally. They search for it. And searching changes the relationship. It creates agency, choice, a sense of direction. This is what control systems fear most. Not excess, not indulgence, but clarity. When a person understands what they want, manipulation becomes harder. Advertising loses efficiency. Moral threats lose weight. Shame loses its grip. The screen did not create this shift. It accelerated it. And acceleration is always treated as danger by institutions built on delay. Listen closely to how modern censorship speaks, and you can still hear the echo of that first ban. This content is harmful. This content is inappropriate. This content must be restricted for your own protection. The words have changed, but the assumption has not. You cannot be trusted with your own responses. You might feel something before you are ready. You might understand yourself too quickly. And that speed is framed as the real risk, because once understanding arrives, it cannot be taken back. Exposure is irreversible. You cannot unfeel what your body has already learned to recognize. This is why the debate is never really about explicitness. It is about timing. Who decides when you are allowed to know, when you are allowed to feel, when your sensations become legitimate? Control depends on delay, on keeping people slightly out of sync with themselves. And every time a new technology threatens that delay, panic follows. Laws are proposed, platforms tighten rules, narratives about protection multiply. But underneath it all sits the same unease first triggered centuries ago. If people learn to regulate their own inner lives, what role remains for authority? This is why the fear persists even when the original book is forgotten. The object does not matter. The function does. Anything that trains private sensation without permission will always be treated as suspect, always framed as dangerous, and always consumed anyway, quietly, individually, in ways that statistics never fully capture. This is not a failure of censorship. It is its natural limit. You can restrict access, you can slow distribution, but you cannot stop recognition. And once recognition happens, the balance shifts, slightly, permanently, in favor of the person who now understands what their body is telling them. The final lesson arrived quietly, long after the trials ended and the headlines faded. Power learned that it had misidentified the threat. It was never the book, not the author, not even the content. The real danger was internalization. The moment when an external stimulus becomes an internal reference. When authority no longer needs to be challenged because it is no longer consulted. This is what frightened institutions most. Not rebellion, independence. A reader who closes a book and carries its logic inside their own sensations is no longer fully reachable. Commands still work, punishments still function, but something has shifted. Obedience becomes conditional. Advice becomes optional. Moral instruction becomes negotiable. The state learned that it could regulate access, but not absorption. That it could police distribution, but not resonance. Once a feeling is understood, it cannot be made strange again. Once a desire becomes familiar, it cannot be framed as foreign or dangerous without resistance.
This realization forced power to adapt, not by eliminating forbidden material, but by surrounding it, contextualizing it, diluting it, turning clarity into noise. This is why modern control prefers excess over absence. Better too much information than precise information. Better stimulation than understanding. Confusion is safer than awareness. And yet, every so often, something slips through. A book, an image, a sentence. Something simple enough to be absorbed whole. Something that does not instruct behavior, only sensation. And each time, the same quiet instability returns. Because control was never meant to compete with self-knowledge. It was meant to prevent it from forming.
This is why the story does not conclude with a ban lifted or a law repealed. It concludes with a condition that repeats itself. As long as humans have bodies, as long as bodies generate sensation, and as long as sensation can be noticed privately, there will always be tension. Not between morality and immorality, but between authority and awareness. The book that started this panic is no longer required reading. Most people will never touch it. They do not need to. Its function has been replicated thousands of times across centuries and mediums. Anywhere desire is articulated clearly. Anywhere sensation is treated as information rather than error. Anywhere people are allowed to feel before being told what those feelings mean. The same unease emerges, the same attempts at regulation follow, and the same failure repeats. Because control can manage behavior, but it cannot fully manage understanding. That happens earlier, quieter, inside the body. This is why the first banned book still matters, not as an artifact, but as evidence. Evidence that power reacts most aggressively not to violence, not to dissent, but to clarity, especially internal clarity. Because once a person understands their own sensations, they stop being entirely predictable. And predictability is the foundation of control. This is not a story about sex. It never was. It is a story about fear. The fear that people might learn to feel without permission. And that fear has never disappeared. It has only learned to speak more politely.